Okay, we'll declare the meeting open. Just good morning, everybody. Council meeting of the 7th of August. Just to remind you that the meeting is live streamed and the video is available on YouTube publicly. So members, speak into your microphones, and as I mentioned yesterday, speak as though you're talking to the person on the other side of the room. That helps. Okay, so calling for any apologies, we do have one from Councillor Catherine Stewart, who's on leave today, and one for Councillor Robson for lateness. So somebody move that. Okay, so moved by Councillor Clout, seconded by Councillor Mason. All in favour say aye. Against, so that's carried. And there is a speaker in the public forum, and that's Mr. Buddy McKyree. So welcome, Buddy, and you've up to 10 minutes, and yeah, I think you're pretty familiar with the format. Thanks.
Kia ora, ngā mihi o te rā kia koutou, tēnā koutou, kia ora rā. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm here representing Ngāi Tamarawaho in this particular issue. Just a little bit of history for the councillors. You might recall that when Route K was first put through, council made a provision for some land to be provided to Ngāi Tamarawaho for a cultural centre. That offer was subsequently withdrawn when council decided to proceed with the subdivision on Smith's Farm, and it was on the basis that council would find another piece of land that might suffice. So there were several attempts on that, but the one that's important in this particular matter was a piece of land on Sulphur Point. Ngāi Tamarawaho has a particular relationship with that land, which has been subject to several development proposals over the years, which have removed it as being what was termed a kitea kai, by first of all the dredging of the port, and then other activities such as the establishment of the Chapel Street wastewater treatment plant and the discharge into the Waikario estuary. However, we were quite interested in that site being offered, and subsequently were quite surprised when the university came forward with a proposal for a marine research centre to be established there, utilising that particular patch of land. We were happy to work with the university on that, and that we see the provision of additional educational facilities in Tauranga as being something worth having. However, we also have a relationship with the Tauranga Marina Society going back some time as well. And with them, we also looked at a proposal for an expanded marina, and I think council's been addressed on that proposal by the marina people. Subsequently, we've gone back to the university and said to the university, why don't we look at some kind of proposal that will take into account the needs of all three parties, the university, Ngāi Tamarawaho, and the Marina Society. We could foresee that unless something like that happened, there might possibly be quite a bit of opposition because of the loss of the reserved space. My understanding is that unfortunately the university does not want to do that. They prefer to proceed separately with their proposal, which is a shame in my humble opinion. And so we understand that at some particular point there will need to be something done about the revocation of the reserve status for that land. Our understanding is that the Ministry of Conservation will require that there be a tick-off from iwi and hapu, Sulphur Point being right in the middle of the Ngāi Tamarawaho rohe. We think that we may have a pivotal part to play in that particular decision. So I've made the university again aware that we would like to put forward a joint proposal with them, all three parties. Basically, I think I could be fair to describe it as being told to go away. Okay, that's all good. So I was just wanting the councillors to be aware that that's the background as far as we're concerned. We're still quite keen to proceed with our expanded marina proposal, which will address a serious shortfall of berthage space within Tauranga, and one that's not only, that's going to just get worse as time goes by with the increase in the population here. That's probably all I have to say, Mr. Mayor and councillors. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Anybody got any questions? Yes, Councillor Baldock and Councillor Kurak.
Kia ora, buddy. Just separating these things out, just the issue of the aspirations for a cultural centre. Are you aware of whether that would be permitted under the reserve classification there, or would it require revocation as well?
I've only got a lay opinion, Councillor Baldock, and I would assume that there would possibly need to be the same process proceeded with, which is the revocation of the reserve status. The urgency for the cultural centre has abated in that there are other possibilities which we're currently looking at.
So then it's more the partnership with the Marina Association that.
Yes, it is. I mean, we're particularly keen on it because, you know, as with other development proposals in the city, we see it as a way of restoring the mana of the hapu without detracting from the use of that space for other activities.
And sorry if I may, one more. So, you know, those considerations, plus whether we are in favour or not of the marine research, are not issues really that come before us today in terms of, at least for myself, in decision making, because we're to focus on the Reserve Act and its requirements. So are you aware that that's the narrowness of our decision today?
Yes, I understand that now. Thank you.
So in terms of the Reserves Act, buddy, and its purpose, it's my understanding that a recreational reserve is there for the enjoyment of many. It's a public space reserved for the enjoyment of many. But a marina, on the other hand, is there for the enjoyment of very few. So in terms of the requirement for it then to go to the minister, why do you think a minister would approve a marina going into that space, given it's enjoyed by so few people?
Yes, thank you, Councillor. Yes, we're aware of, I think I mentioned that we believe there would be opposition because of the loss of that reserve space for public use. And one of the challenges, I think, facing the Marina Society and ourselves is how we can mitigate or compensate for that. And it's quite a central part to the proposal that we put forward to Council earlier. Whether that's sufficient to satisfy the Minister, I don't know. So we won't know until it's put in front of him.
On two questions, Councillor Malloy and Councillor Clout.
Kia ora, buddy. Hey, if I've no doubt that the marina proposal will come back at some stage. If that was granted permission and that went ahead, and the Marine Research Centre was also in place, would that then cover most of your requirements?
Oh yes, and I mean, you know, there are opportunities in there to share use of the space, if you like. For example, I would imagine the car parking area would be used by the university during the week. The main use for the car park for the marina would be at the weekend. So, you know, you have those kind of things. There's something like a proposal for an additional 250 berths, so that I think the actual demand is in excess of 300. So it's a partial addressing of that. There's also, I think, the opportunity to provide berthage space for the university's vessels, should that be the case. There's an ability to perhaps share costs in terms of getting utilities out there, fresh water and that kind of thing. There are a number of advantages to both parties, and I just can't understand why they don't acknowledge that working together is a sensible thing to do here.
Kia ora, buddy. I just want to clarify something. The impression I got from listening to you this morning was that if we proceed to recommend this revocation to the Minister, that Ngāi Tamarawaho would not endorse that. Is that the message I received correct or not?
No, that's correct.
That is correct. Thank you.
Thanks, Buddy.
Thank you,
Seems to be
Mr.
the
Mayor.
questions. Because the question was raised, I think it's fair to give Alistair Jones from the university a chance just to talk about one or two of the things that were raised in that submission. So, yeah, and if you just want to use that same seat there as Buddy. So this will be treated as another speaker in the public forum.
Thanks, Mayor Brownless. I wasn't expecting to talk today, but thank you for the opportunity. We've always signalled our willingness to work alongside Ngāi Tamarawaho in shared interests of collaboration, and if you look at the building that's been created, that was done in the spirit of partnership, and particularly our relationship with Huria Marae and Tamati in terms of being our kaumātua. The new chair of Ngāi Tamarawaho, Shane, has indicated a willingness to discuss their views. The issue is not one of not being willing to talk. We've met many times, but Buddy has asked and insisted that the university express formal support for the marina expansion, which is difficult for the university to do, supporting a commercial entity and we are a Crown entity. We're more than happy to, and a formal MOU was put along to those lines. It is difficult for the university to support a commercial decision without having seen the full business case and the implications. So we have no problem working alongside the marina, and I've made that very clear from the beginning. But to sign a formal agreement would be difficult at this time for a university to do. So we collaborate with many parties, both locally, nationally and internationally, and collaboration. I think we pride ourselves on collaboration with local iwi, hapu, and also with local bodies and commercial entities.
Any question for Professor Jones? That being the case, thank you, Alistair. There's no chairperson's report. There are no late items, but regarding confidential business to be transferred into the open, I would like to move that the legal advice be transferred into the open in this instance. If I get a seconder. Okay, it's seconded by Councillor Baldock. I'll just speaking to her, I'll explain why. I believe that it's that there's nothing in there that is prejudicial to any position of council, and in fact it's a good explanation to both the public and a reminder to ourselves on the basis of which we're to make our decision. So I will put that. All in favour say aye. Against, so that's carried. And so we're just getting some copies made, so we'll distribute them in a minute, but for the benefit of those who might be listening, I will read this. It's not long, and it just focuses on our minds on what the decision is today. So this is a note for elected members on the hearing of objections to revoke the reserve status of part of Marine Park. So, number one, in hearing submissions and making a decision, you are acting as the council in its capacity as the administering body of the reserve. This is different to the council's general capacity as a local authority. It is important that the two roles are not confused, or the decision making may be compromised and could be subject to challenge. Relevant considerations. 2. The decision as administering body is whether, having heard and considered the submissions, to request the Minister to revoke the reserve status. This is a decision under the Reserves Act and must be made only on Reserves Act consideration. This largely boils down to whether the part of the reserve is surplus to requirements, or at least whether revocation will not result in any appreciable loss of reserve amenity for the public, and in brackets, which may, for example, take into account other reserve land or open space available to the public. 3. The council, in its capacity as local authority, may wish to lease the land to a university for a marine research and educational facility, and, quite properly, you may have a view on that proposal. However, the merits or otherwise of the university's proposal is not directly relevant to the decision under the Reserves Act. The decision under the Reserves Act is not a choice as to what is a better use of the land, recreation, reserve or marine research educational facility. Rather, it is whether the proposed loss of reserve land is appropriate and can be justified in the light of the Reserves Act. And then it just talks about the hearing itself and the requirement to hear with an open mind. But so that's been distributed for the public, and hopefully that will help form part of the discussion and eventual conclusion. So, any declarations of conflicts of interest? And then onto the business proper, so it's DC 153. Bridget. Okay. So Bridget and Gary, you may wish to have some sort of an introduction, and then there might be some questions. So, thank you.
Good morning. This report presents recommendations for deliberations on the intention to seek the revocation of the reserve status of an area of land at Marine Park. And obviously, as we've heard today, the revocation will enable a potential long-term lease to the University of Waikato in order to establish a new marine research and educational facility. A detailed background was provided in my report to outline the process that has been undertaken to get to this point. In short, we've been working with the University of Waikato since late 2015 to assess possible locations where a new facility could be located. Numerous council-owned and private-owned sites have been considered as part of this process, and the council-owned sites at Marine Park and Northern Sulphur Point were shortlisted as potential locations for the facility. Turning to Marine Park itself, it's a recreation reserve pursuant to the Reserves Act 1977. The park is reclaimed land that was created by the Bay of Plenty Harbour Board using material dredged from the harbour. Now, the part of Marine Park where the reserve status to be revoked as consulted on is indicated on blue in the aerial in front of you. This location was selected as it would maintain a large area of open space to the north, including the Star Compass. It also accommodates the future formalisation of the overflow grass car park, and now that's the location of the former BMX track, and development of additional boat ramps to the south. In terms of consultation, this took place between 12 November 2018 and 14 December last year, and we held 2 open day sessions. In total, 498 submissions were received. In response to the question, would you support the revocation of the reserve status of 6,952 square metres of land as part of Marine Park for the purposes of a long-term lease to the University of Waikato to enable the development of a new research and educational facility? 58% responded no and 42% responded yes. Now, the main concerns raised through the public consultation and engagement with stakeholders are outlined in my report. And as we've just heard, Council's role in this matter is as administering body, focusing on the loss of the reserve area, and the final decision is obviously made by the Minister of Conservation. It's my conclusion that the area proposed for the reserve revocation is not currently utilised for any significant recreational purposes and is unlikely to result in appreciable loss of reserve amenity or level of service for the public in the wider city context. My paper outlines 2 options to ensure a final decision is reached and provide clarity for these groups around the proposed facility and its location. The staff recommendation is to progress with the notification to the Department of Conservation of Council's intention to seek the revocation of the reserve status from this space. I'm happy to answer any questions at this point.
Thanks, Gary and Bridget. Just while that map's up there, the yellow lines on the east side of Cross Road, that's reserve. That's the same reserve classification, correct?
It is indeed. All of those parts in yellow form part of Marine Park.
Okay. And the land that's at the southern end of that on the east side of Cross Road where the car parking is, I think it's used for trailer boats parking, and the other bits which are currently under commercial lease, is that all fee simple all the way down there to Cross Road?
There is one large fee simple piece of land, correct, and there are some long-term leases to the commercial tenancies at the southern end where you can see the buildings. They're registered leases with rights of renewal for quite significant terms.
So it is a potential option of obviously incurring considerable cost, but it is a potential option of a swap if such was needed or deemed necessary by the Minister at some future point, that could be reclassified as reserve as an exchange for the bit we're seeking to revoke if that was the decision of Council. Just touching on that. I know you haven't delivered a paper on it. I've asked about it on many occasions, but just clarifying that.
That's working. Yes, in response through the chair, the cost, we'd need to look into the process and cost, so quantifying what those lease terms would be. Effectively, I think you're saying to buy out those leases. There would need to be a strong reason to do that. It could possibly not be achievable. We'd need to look into the Property Law Act implications of that, and there'd need to be a really strong case in terms of exchanging that land with reference to it being an exchange for Reserves Act purposes with the land that's proposed for the university facility. Under the Reserves Act, we'd then need to look at the attributes of the land, so the recreation reserve attributes and whether they're similar or comparable. So that's further analysis that would need to be done.
I mean, clearly it's not the same, but there's no legal leases over the car parked area, are there? That's just council. I think so.
Use a pointer. I don't know if you've got one, because not everybody will be aware of the land we're talking about here. That's a boat park at the moment, and that's commercial leases. But not by the water.
Just that last bit, the what's used now for boat trailer parking there, even if the commercial stuff was not recoverable, that could be considered as a possibility. Vague in general, I understand, but just touching on it.
At this time, I understand the boat park area are on short-term arrangements. However, they were relocated, as I understand it, from when the Nautilus was constructed. So it would be a matter of trying to find, I guess, another location where they might be able to store those boats. Certainly the tenancies down the bottom end are on long-term registered leases, but the boat park area and then the outrigger club and the shed at the northern end there, obviously permanent fixtures need to be looked at.
I think we had a submission through the process from the Outrigger Club that wanted to be relocated across the other side, didn't they, at some point?
Kerry, in your report you make a lot of reference to the trailer parking, and I guess having parked my own boat there many times, and also talked to a lot of the boaties, the trailer boaties, it seems to me that if you look at other cities around the country where they are managing their trailer boat parking much better than we are, they're well ordered. In many cases they're paid. It's a revenue generator, and they're utilising the land very effectively. And it seems to me this is pretty haphazard over here. So what I'm asking you is, do you think that with better management of the parking facility down there and more organisation, we could achieve what the boat is looking for in the first place, which is actually just better utilisation and therefore more capacity of the trailer boating facility?
Certainly in my view, and as was identified in the observational study, it was observed that parking was haphazard, and one of their recommendations was to look towards formalising some of those parking spaces to tidy up that situation. My own personal observations, having been down there on a busy day, is one vehicle and trailer just perhaps parked early in the morning before other visitors could have a knock-on effect for the other potential users. So certainly that's something that potentially could be looked at.
Yeah, a couple of questions, and apologies for lateness. I don't know whether that was passed through to the chair, but thank you. I'm slightly concerned. Have the staff read the legal advice? Because the opening words from the desk to my right were about the University of Waikato. And I'm just trying to get clarity about what the topic of discussion is, because my understanding of the advice, and I think this is critical to the conversation here, is put to one side any views you have about merits, desirability. My understanding of, we're looking at this land in terms of framed by the considerations within the Reserves Act. And I'm just surprised that staff started the first topic, item, subject of their brief to the report was the University of Waikato. If someone can respond to that, I have a specific question as well in relation to a particular paragraph in the report, but if I could get a response to that initially.
Yep, through the chair, our normal process when we're presenting any report is to give the context of where the report came from and what the history was. So while we are working within the Reserves Act, the reason we started looking at it was around the request from the university. Certainly the decision and all the assessment in the report, and that's why we're talking about the utilisation of the reserve area is about the reserve use, but it was just to provide some context and to recap where we come from.
Okay, in which case, if I have a specific question, it's in relation to paragraph 26, and it talks about the share of area. It talks about revocation reserve status of 6,952 square metres as part of Marine Park, total 112,369 square metres, which of course gives an approximate percentage of 6.2% of the land being revoked. Could someone give me what share of the grassed area adjacent to water we are losing? Because when I look at the map, it seems...
Sorry, if we'd had that question in advance of the meeting, we would have been able to respond, but we can't do that sitting here. the map, the intention is to retain a public access
I
across the
understand
front.
that.
Yeah.
But I think the intent of my question is clear. So I'm happy to enter into a sort of a debate and rephrase the question if it's not clear, but I'm talking about the land, the total land adjacent to the water, i.e. to the left of that road that runs up the spine of the park. What percentage of the green space are we talking about revoking? And has no one done that calculation? It would seem pertinent.
I mean, looking at it as an uneducated eye, 25% perhaps. But yeah, I know that's not necessarily the answer.
It does strike me as a more significant number than 6.2. That's the point that I'm making.
Councillor Kurak?
My question is around the term appreciable loss, and it's been used a number of times, both this morning verbally and in the report. And when I look up in the definition of appreciable, it is large or important enough to be noticed. So when we look at the size of that, I mean, I certainly notice that on that piece of land. It's very noticeable and or important enough. So when I look at that map, given the limited public space adjoining the harbour we have, apart from the beachfront, that's pretty important. So the statements made in the report that it's unlikely to result in appreciable loss, that's what I really struggle with. So in terms of what context did you frame that when you made that judgment and made that call that it's no appreciable loss? But, you know, to me, I can't agree. So perhaps a bit more substance around that.
Certainly, and in terms, I guess we're looking at the overall network of reserves that Tauranga City as a whole has for residents to utilise. So we're looking at our entire park network. Is that 7,000 odd square metres within our entire park network going to be an appreciable loss in terms of our overall city level of service? Was really where we're heading with using that term. And certainly also looking at the usage of the area. What's the demand for the area at the moment? It seems to be low from what we've observed. So would people realise that this area has been lost and appreciate the fact that it's been lost, yes or no? And based on what we've observed, low usage would indicate that it is unlikely to be identified or appreciated.
So in terms of the usage, you use the words at the moment. So you don't take into account potential future use. It's about today, but you don't look at tomorrow.
We obviously don't know what tomorrow holds and what the future is going to hold. Obviously, we've identified within the report we are in a growing city, so demand could increase, but with changes in recreation, sports and types of recreation, we simply don't know what the future will hold.
So you use the word, you explain that it's a growing city, and we all know that, and will continue growing for many years. And you said the demand could increase. On what basis did you use the word could? Wouldn't it have been better to use the term would? On what basis did you use the word could?
Through the chair, I'd just like to address the fact that there's a clear acknowledgement this is a growing city. This assessment is also in the wider context of the work that council spaces and places and planning teams are doing for provision of parks and reserves in growth areas and in the wider city network, and that work is ongoing. And I'm not an expert in that space. I'm certainly aware of it, and the spaces and places team could bring more information back to the council, and I think does through the projects committee and other committees. So that's the context for our opinion there.
Because, but probably in the end, it's for us to make that judgment on the, we've all seen the growth down there, and we probably have to make that final decision. But
But it is important.
Yeah,
because
it
when
is
the minister
important.
makes
Yeah.
a decision, we want to be clear.
Yeah.
If
So,
I could
and-
just comment on that. So I don't know if we've got the other map with the other square areas, but what we have done is looked at those other areas is that they would be able to provide future capacity for some of that growth, and that's covered off in the report in terms of the expansion of the boat facility areas, etc. So they are. So we've looked at that and said how would those areas be utilised as the city grows in the future, and are comfortable with that level. It is absolutely a judgment, but it's not that those matters haven't been considered in the report. And in the attachment 6, the recreation and reserve planners have done the assessment and looked at these factors as well. So as Bridget's just covered, so that is addressed. Again, it's a judgment call, and all that information is there for you to consider and weigh up in your own mind as to whether you agree or have an alternative view.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. Thank you, Christine. But just wrapping this up to try and get a good understanding of the context. So, as I understand it, as I've heard, the context is in the wider network, which would include neighbourhood reserves. All the reserves are within the city, correct? But so my question is that wouldn't it be more appropriate to isolate the scope of that context to that reserve space directly adjoining water, because it's quite significantly different to general reserves across the city? Differentiate.
And I've certainly had that discussion with our reserves team. They don't currently have any policy that specifically looks to provide harbour side reserve spaces as a specific policy in its own right.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the reserve management plan on our website, and I can't find how many reserves we have. We've got all sorts of different reserves: neighbourhood reserves, coastal reserves, heritage, high profile, etc. So how many reserves do we have across the city?
I'm informed approximately 300.
And do we know the square meterage or approximate size of that area?
Not offhand.
Clarification, I asked earlier about percentage of space lost, and the answer I was given is the percentage of space was assessed against the total area of reserves. How can that possibly be the fact if we don't know what the total area of the reserves was? Just clarification on that point, please.
We know that we have thousands, I would think it would be in the thousands, at least hundreds of hectares of reserve land, and if you look in terms of the coastal reserve area, again, significant. So this is relatively small in terms of our overall network, so we haven't gone and looked at the numbers, but from our knowledge of our overall network of reserves in the city, it's very large.
So can we just confirm that that includes all parks, not just reserves? Because we're looking at the overall green space, and the objections from a lot of the people that weren't supportive was the loss of open space. So I'm only looking at the reserve management plan, but there are other open spaces. So if we're looking at the overall loss, I guess, to the city, do we have a figure of how much that would be, including all our parks and open space?
Don't have that information to hand. Do we know that, Claire? Have we got that? We can drag that out, but I don't think we've got it at our fingertips at the moment.
If we were to calculate the percentage across all of our open spaces, yes, there will be. Obviously, our reserve management plan covers our parks and reserves, held under the Reserves Act generally, but there are stormwater reserve and other pieces of green space that we own. So we could do that for you, but it would take, just a little bit of time to do that analysis on all of that green space and then work out the percentage.
Probably in the initial stages, parks and reserves first would be the most important, because that's what part of our decision making, but it would be interesting to know how it sits, because as you say, I mean, we've got a significant amount of stormwater reserves across the city, which is open space and green space.
Councillor Malloy.
The question to the university, if I may, in terms of appreciable loss, when we look at that piece of land up there, it it looks, you know, quite significant. It's got a large chunk there in the middle of that green space. But my understanding, if it could be confirmed, is that this will be designed, well, for a starter, there's only be about a third of that land will be in building space. Some will be in car parking, and some will be in other amenity. I understand, and I'd like it confirmed, please, it'll be designed very much as not only a research facility but also a public amenity, which will encourage the public to use that facility and to access it. So it will be, in terms of a appreciable loss of amenity, my understanding is that's not going to happen. So if I could get some confirmation from the university that my understanding is correct.
I will, in the interest of information, is important to making decisions. So if we can have an answer to that, that'd be helpful.
Thank you. What we're proposing, and it is proposed at this stage, is that it's only a two-storey building to blend into the landscape, and it would be 50% of the space would be for public use. It has been designed to engage the public in greater understanding of our marine area, and the proposal is that there is hard yard space, building space on there. We are reducing the laboratory space by having mobile laboratories in smart containers, which is the smart way to do things to have minimal environmental impact, and to open up as much space for educational purposes. Those educational purposes would, and the discussions we've been having, are related to the whole public engagement around marine environment, as opposed to being a closed-off research environment. It would be we've always said from the beginning, this was a public amenity. It's to build capability and identity within Tauranga, and to create a unique, I think, blend of research public engagement space, which would be unique globally.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Supplementary
Yeah,
question,
thanks.
Councillor Grant.
Before you go, Alistair, yeah, supplementary to that as well. So this 50% for space for the public, is this going to be used by the public on a daily basis? At any day, they wish to go and view what they want to view? Is that what's going to happen?
That is a proposal. It may not be open 24/7, but it's the idea is that school groups, parents where take their children, things like that. So it is actually a way we're not expecting huge numbers, but obviously there would be the ability for people to go there on an ongoing basis.
No, thanks for that. The point I'm trying to make here, because we know that there will be a loss of level of service for our public, but it's just that when you bring the public back into that to say, well, hey, this is what's happening in our backyard, they want to know what the Marine Research Centre is doing, and that's why I've always said right from the very beginning, we want them to be part of it, because in a sense we're taking a little bit away, but let's give it back. I think that's important.
Just to clarify that, the modelling we have done is related. We believe that this would bring the public back into using the reserve. In actual fact, it would maximise the public use in terms of engaging with the sea and the marine environment in quite a different way than just being a reserve. So we're trying to design something unique which would make this an integral part of the city, as well as create better understanding of our marine environment and the coastal processes that are associated with that.
Good to hear.
Is a question for our staff? Is it Councillor? Yeah, or is it a question for Professor James? I know what he said. Okay. Yeah, that's good.
Morning, Alistair. Is that modelling shareable? You said you've modelled the usage. Is that modelling shareable? It would be helpful information.
Sure, we haven't modelled it in terms of the detailed modelling, because obviously that costs quite a lot for us to do. We've modelled the concept of what we're trying to do, where and had an architect draw up, which you've all seen. You've seen those things. What we've tried to do is to say, and the modelling is not a mathematical modelling, but it's more, the public space on the top floor, so that, and the laboratories on the lower floor, and thinking also about the car parking, hard stands, and the other environments. So when I say modelling, it's probably an over exaggeration, but it's a conceptual thing at this stage, because if we go to that, that's about a couple of $1 million.
I mean, I'd take exaggeration rather than over-exaggeration.
Relate to Professor, no, okay, that's fine, so I just have one question, then I'll go to, this is not for you, Professor, so it's fine. When it comes to, if this was to go to the Minister or the Department of Conservation, what would be, are there any potential deal breakers? Is there something that the Minister would say, if I don't have the agreement of X, Y, or Z, I won't sign it? Is there anything in there that, for example, do you need the agreement of all iwi, for example? Or is that just something that's taken into consideration?
That's correct. There are no set criteria in the Act for the Minister's consideration. It will be all of the relevant information that the Minister deems relevant.
Now, I've just got an answer from Christine to a previous question, then I'll go to Councillor Cloughton Granger. Yeah.
So just in terms of our infrastructure strategy, which was issued as part of the last LTP, so it'll be a few years out of date, but only 2, I think. We have 1,549 hectares of public open space over 394 sites, and we have 18.5 kilometres of coastal reserve, which is 224 hectares of coastal reserve. And just coming back to the previous discussion, so looking at the particular site and the utilisation of that, and in terms of the network as a whole, we've formed the view that the revocation would meet the requirements of the Reserves Act. We have had that reviewed, so the whole report has been reviewed by Simpson Grierson, who have looked at our analysis as well, and they're comfortable with the recommendations that we're making on the basis of the information that's there. So at the end of the day, it's really a council call based on the submissions that you've received and your overall assessment of it as to whether you're comfortable proceeding to recommend to the Minister or not. So hopefully that's helpful.
To Councillor Clark, who's been very patient.
Thank you very much. I try to be in these chambers. So the point that you raised, Mr. Mayor, about any sort of deal breakers regarding the endorsement or otherwise of iwi and hapu was very important to me. So you've answered that question. Thank you. Has someone got a? Okay. And then the other thing I really want to tease out is on page 50 of our agenda, which is, because one of the key considerations for me is how many people are using that space at the moment in the blue and in that general area. And on page 50, we see a graph there showing the number of people using it, or seen to be using that area over defined periods of time, I think in 3 or 4 hour blocks. So I just want to make sure that I'm reading this right. The maximum number of people counted were 11, and I'm believing that's over a 4 hour period. You could also say, on average, if you drew a sort of a halfway line, you might be getting 4 or 5 people per 3 or 4 hours using that part of the reserve. So am I reading that correctly? Because it doesn't seem to be well used based on those numbers.
That's how I also interpret the information provided. If I can just, so if we're looking above, we're talking about obviously the revocation area and the 2 red squares where those observations are undertaken, and certainly the counts were undertaken every 4 hours on those survey days, and they're a point of time. And yeah.
Thank you.
Entry to that one, yes. Councillor Granger's being very patient. But
Yeah, look,
let's let Max as a supplementary, and then definitely to you. Yeah.
Thanks. Just my question following on for that is in relation to do we know, have you some sort of estimate on how many people from within the actual Sulphur Point, various facilities actually did make a submission. And the reason I'm asking is because having been involved in all three consultations, so the first one Councillor Clout and I went to very bravely was to the right at the tip of the Yacht and Powerboat Club, and we discussed it there, and there was a large number of people in the room, the members and that, and the overwhelming, because we were going to thinking about putting the thing right at the tip of there was a space up there. The overwhelming response from those people in that room was that, why don't you put it down near the old BMX track, because nobody uses it. Everybody agreed. So, and I'm going to point, and it'll come to a question. The second time, I wasn't able to make it, and Councillor Clark very bravely fronted the pack on one Saturday morning, I think. That with the secondary one, which was on the curve near the game fishing club. And again, the same thing was, why didn't you put it down by the old BMX track, because nobody uses it. And again, in a lot of the submissions, the same sort of things happen. So my question is that from a very practical perspective, not taking percentages in that, but the people actually using it, living and working and actually, really, really part of that, are saying, put it where nobody uses it, would give quite a strong common sense indication of where we are. Would you sort of agree with that?
Certainly, in terms of the consultation undertaken with the revocation, we didn't ask where the areas that they use or frequent in that locality, so we can't define. The responses were just generic by names of submitters and didn't have any directive questions within that survey to identify what specific parts that they utilise. So I can't drill down into that too much at this time.
Sorry, supplementary. There would be it would be common sense to sort of suggest that the people who used that and spent a lot of their time up there would have a greater appreciation of the facility than, say, boat owners who might come half a dozen times a year at peak times and see that as the big problem, rather than, you know what I mean, it's the amount of time you spend and work there versus occasional use, for example, might have a different weighting in terms of their opinion.
They may certainly have a better understanding of the issues for that area, absolutely.
Granger.
Hey, thanks. Just through the chair, another question to Alistair. Alistair, I'm sorry, but I think it's important.
Well, but we've got to keep this.
I know we can't let him run away just a little bit too quick, and I won't take long, Alistair. Just in regards to the modelling and design for the public area, could the council be included in this? And why I say that is maybe the likes of Tangata Whenua would have come on board as well. It's just that I feel that we'd like to be involved. What's your thoughts on that?
Councillor Granger, when we designed this building, we went out for very wide consultation, and as I said in my opening statement, that we are all about consultation. I would expect that we'd be coming back. This is going to be a long process to build this. If we were to get the green light, we have to raise the money, and we've already had good indications. But our relationship in terms of with Ngāi Tamarau Wāhau, the wider iwi, our iwi advisory group, would all be part of that, just as would the wider community in terms of what they want. We're not going anywhere, and our whole process of engaging with Tauranga has been community focused, and it is unique.
No, that's sort of what we're looking forward to the Marine Research Cafe as well. Thanks for that.
Councillor Currack and Robson.
Yes, to Christine Jones. Christine, you mentioned some assessment work undertaken by Simpson Grierson. Has that been shared with councillors?
So what I've said is they reviewed our report, so we provided them our report and said this is our assessment under the Reserves Act, this is conclusions, here's how we've done it, and they were comfortable with what was in the report. So we just asked them to check whether they had any concerns, whether there was any gaps in terms of the work we've done, and they were comfortable.
So that was just verbal feedback saying we're comfortable.
I'm looking at Gary. I think an email. So we sent them the draft report as we were developing it, and they came back and they gave us some suggestions of things, and then we finalised it. So we're comfortable that we've assessed the relevant factors in doing the work to present the report and the recommendation to you. So I was just trying to give you a level of assurance that we just haven't sat in isolation and not considered the legislative considerations.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know what the brief was to Simpson Grierson, but it's very difficult for them unless they're on the ground to, say, assess for total balance or pure objectivity. It's, more legal compliance, which is a very, very different standard, as all those people invested in Enron would know. A couple of questions through to staff with regard to reserves policies and that. What's the sort of distance we'd like reserves to be from population? How close do we want reserves to be to people? There's a sort of we'd like things to be within a certain distance. What's the current figure that we work to?
Okay, yeah, okay.
We assess, we provide or give different reserves a different sort of function. So neighbourhood reserves, we're looking at within 500 metres of most residences. Local area open space is within 2 kilometres of most residences, which this marine park falls into that category. And suburban area open space, I believe, is 5 kilometres within 5 kilometres of most residences. But I would have to check the 5 kilometre one for the suburban area open space, which this reserve functions as, because I can't actually remember if that's the right number, but it depends on the function of the reserve. So.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. The 2 kilometre one's an interesting one. Obviously the nearer it is with an ageing population, the more accessible it is. Have we got the population forecast? We're talking about intensification of the Te Papa Peninsula. We're trying to get significant population growth at the top end of the Te Papa Peninsula. Have we got the population at the top of Te Papa Peninsula now, and say the forecast growth of what that's likely to be or what we're targeting in, 30 years? Just to get some feel for what the increase in people within that radius for this particular reserve is. Because, of course, it may be significantly greater than the 2% per annum that we're expecting as a city. It may, in fact, be 10 or 15% per year. And then in terms of, you can see why I want the number, just to understand.
We're working on the Te Papa Spatial Plan project at the moment and through UFTI, so we haven't reallocated. So the forecasts that we have are based on the previous thinking. We haven't reallocated based on intensification, and we are still working through the feasibility in terms of the whole Te Papa area. There are some early thinking that you might look to somewhere around about 4,000. I'm trying to think whether it's households or people. I think the question is whether is this going to be sort of a local walkable park, and is the fact that one slice of it is not going to be available going to significantly impact on people choosing to go and walk or recreate in that area. So, and there are other locations close by as well. So we don't have the spatial distribution at mesh block level for the Te Papa Peninsula. It is something that we're still working on.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I was thinking ahead and I'd thought about those factors, because I'd hate to make a decision that didn't take into account population growth and intensification to Te Papa Peninsula. I'd hate to make a decision today that forgot about the decisions I made yesterday and the decisions I will be making tomorrow, or at least up until October. Is there an assessment of visual amenity? And the reason I ask is because people seem to be, there's discussion around square metres in the report, but in my experience, and certainly when I was putting my pool in my vast front lawn, I made sure there was no visual obstruction, because sightlines are important, and whacking a 2-storey building in the middle of what is effectively open green space really does change the visual amenity. That feeling of space one gets when one isn't looking at a 2-storey building is quite different. Is there any assessment being made of the effect on that?
Through the chair. Look, I don't know whether that actually should be part of a consideration or criteria that you should be basing a decision on today. Certainly, it's not something within the terms of the Reserve Act that should be considered in this decision-making process.
Door was opened by the previous speaker talking about the size of the building,
the square meterage. So this topic's already been opened in this.
Yeah, I think you'll find that the previous speaker isn't part of the decision-making process or subject to the same scrutiny that councillors' decision-makers will be.
I've been looking up things on Mappy, so I may have missed this question being asked already, but I'll ask it again. But should council today vote to revoke, and then it goes to the minister, does the minister then welcome any further submissions from particularly iwi, or do they take everything that we have as being the final word? I'm curious about that, please.
It is a matter for discretion of the minister. The Act doesn't specify that, and that's could be certainly open to the minister. The minister would take their own advice on the scope of information that they might receive beyond this stage of the process.
So based on what we have in front of us, where there is one iwi in full support on letterhead of the iwi signed by the Chief Executive, and another on 2 emails signed by a consultant representing one hapu and one iwi. I'd like to ask Carlo Ellis, if I may, he's arrived into the chamber, a couple of questions about that, if I can. Carlo,
that might put Carlo in a difficult position, so you try the question,
yes,
but we'll just see
yes,
if he can answer. Yeah.
I have asked him if he would answer some things, but yeah, I understand the complexities, but that is what is in front of us, Carlo, and it is kind of unusual that we're not getting a formal letter from either Ngāti Pūkenga, from the Chief Executive or from the Chair, and the same thing from Ngāi Tamarawaho. Why do you think that is? How should we read that, really?
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing is that all of the communications have come from mandated representatives, so we do have to take them as representative. I would say in terms of Ngāti Pūkenga, one thing to understand there is they don't have the structure that Ngāti Ranginui and Ngaitirangi and some of the other hapu have. So it's not surprising they don't often communicate in the same fashion, i.e. in the way that Ngaitirangi's responded with a letterhead letter. So that's probably not unusual. Probably would have been best if that was from somebody that's not in both parts of it. But I don't know where that landed in discussions around having that confirmation from Ngāti Pūkenga from another person representative at their end. And same thing with Ngāi Tamarawaho. I mean, the thing that we check at Takawanga is that person mandated to represent it, and they are listed there. So we have to accept that that's the position that's come through. I guess the only other piece of context that I would give is that there is the Tauranga Moana management plan that was signed off by all 3 iwi that does have some commentary in there around position with regard to marinas and jettings and jetties and moorings, so that's another thing to take into consideration as well.
What does it say, since it's not in our minds? What does it say in regard to marinas and the potential expansion of the marina?
So there's a in the 2016 to 2026 document, it does talk about marina expansion, jetties and moorings, and it says that the 3 iwi have expressed, so that's Ngaitirangi, Ngāti Ranginui, Ngāti Pūkenga, have expressed that they I think are opposed to further expansion, and they have a statement in there that they would expect to be consulted early about that change. I know that's different to what Ngāi Tamarawaho's put forward, and I do need to express that, when these documents are done, they are subject to different discussions and they may change positions. So I think they just need to be all part of the mix.
Councillor Kurak and then Morris.
Just further to Councillor Robson and his concern over the loss of visual amenity. Amenity within the Reserves Act would or must include the visual amenity, but we can't take into account the university's proposal in making our decision. But a structure which basically cuts the reserve in half surely should be taken into account because it compromises that whole open green space. So what could we take into account? Could we take into account by the revocation providing an opportunity for a large structure to compromise the visual amenity, not specifically looking at a specific proposal, but could we take that into account as a reason not to support revocation? Not being specific on a proposal, but the impact of that revocation in terms of compromising visual amenity.
So through the chair, just on the first point, as regards the statement of cutting in half the green space, just want to be clear that there is at least a 20-metre boundary proposed from the western boundary of the park to the area proposed for the university, ensuring that green connection there. In terms of the question around the visual impact and the extent that can be taken into account, the Reserves Act and the advice we've had around that is clear around the factors we can consider, that should be considered around the reserve's values. Amenity would be one of those. The fact that the intended use for the land that is proposed for revocation is not a key consideration, but is relevant context in the decision-making process. It can't be sort of devoid of that end purpose. But it's important to bear in mind that if we got to that stage, there'd be a further process of resource consent for that development, at which stage visual amenity effects would be much more certain and considered. So at this stage, it's really a real focus on the values of the particular area that would be lost from the reserve.
Triggers the question, so if it was revoked, what would the underlying class be? It would be commercial. What would it be then reverted to, or changed to?
So this process would simply remove that layer of reserve classification. Its underlying zoning would remain, and that would be another step in the process then in looking at through a resource consent process or a plan change, what the appropriate zoning would be. It would be another step in the process.
Chair, the other factor that council will be giving a lease, and so through the lease you could specify certain building envelope parameters that if you wish to manage height and amenity through that mechanism.
Councillor Morris.
I yield to Councillor Baldock, who I think is wanting to ask something.
Councillor Baldock.
If questions are finished, I'm happy to move.
Not finished yet. So what we'll do is once they're finished, we'll have a little break because I think deliberations will take a while, and we may need to use various facilities. So, but then you've signalled that, and I will note that. Yeah. So, Councillor Morris, your question. If you.
No, I was just making the observation. I know which way is up, and I don't need anybody to tell me where north is. So I'm ready to make a decision at the appropriate time.
Oh. Okay. Well, yep, Councillor Robson.
Councillor Kurak's question, the underlying zoning is?
The current zoning under the district plan is active open space, and it has an amenity landscape area overlay on top of it, and a flood hazard risk area alongside the coast as well.
Okay, so we'll just adjourn for 15 minutes for a break and then resume here in about 10:30. The meeting to order again. And Councillor Baldock, you did signal that you might wish to move something.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Your Worship. Yes, I will move the staff recommendation that Council A, B and, well, we don't need to do C anymore, do we? So A and B. If there is a seconder, I will speak to it.
Note that a number of people wanted to second it, so that's good to keep it fair. Okay, yielded to Councillor Granger. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, I first of all like to thank staff for all the work they have done throughout this process, and the report we have in front of us, which does help to, I think, clarify our thinking. The legal advice which has come out of confidential is very relevant. And I thank all the submitters through the process too that we've heard from. A lot of passion involved. I better start my clock. There's many factors at play, but they can't affect our decision today, really. There are lots of shadows over the whole thing. But, and it's been quite a long and tough process, but it's a fairly simple decision for me today, and I hope for all of us when we look at really what we have to decide. It's not about the marine expansion plan. It's not about whether iwi or hapu have had broken promises about cultural centres and other matters. We know there have been many broken promises in this city in regard to tangata whenua. And if I might just add a little aside, it was great that unanimously Council did keep one promise this term in the decision to return or to give the land at Chapel Street and the mobile site as part of a long promise some time ago. It is about an application by the University of Waikato for the use of the land for a research centre, which is why it's okay for the report to talk about that. But it's not about the pros and cons of that application, and that's what is made clear to us by the legal opinion. It's almost like I felt this morning coming in like an RMA commissioner sitting here at a decision, and probably would have been interesting and perhaps a good process if we all had to give a written decision. So we had to really focus very clearly on the issues that are in front of us, and they are in the legal opinion.
Move, Chair.
I'll read the opinion in paragraph 2, which the Mayor read out before. This largely boils down to whether the part of the reserve is surplus to requirements, or at least whether revocation will not result in any appreciable loss of reserve amenity for the public, which may, for example, take into account other reserve land or open space available to the public. So for me, answering the first, it is not surplus. So the answer to that is no. I couldn't seek revocation on that basis. But when it comes to the second point, will it result in any appreciable loss? The report talks about 6.59% of what is the entire 105,417 square metres. I did a bit of work on Mappy whilst questions were being held, and it's not accurate, of course, but to try and just look at the seaward side of Cross Road and not all of the parking areas right down the bottom, I think it's possibly about 80,000 square metres there, possibly 8.69% if you wanted to round it out. It's certainly less than 10% of what we sort of identify as being that large piece of reserve on the seafront. And I am comfortable deciding today that it will not result in any appreciable loss of the use of that space to have the marine research facility, if it is to get approval from the Minister to go ahead there. Also impacting on that is that the facility will not take away the waterfront access along that whole strip, which I think is an important consideration. We are, of course, if we do decide to, by majority, proceed with this, it goes to the Minister. The Minister has discretion. The Minister will take a lot of things into account, I think, and one of the things will be about the iwi support or opposition. I hope that gets resolved a little further and becomes a little clearer, but that will be a matter for the Minister. Of course, in my decision, when I say it won't result in a loss, in any appreciable loss, that is, of course, subjective. You know, there is future growth to consider. There is other proposals that may come forward and so on. But we can't know for certain. We can't look into a crystal ball. Today, as I sit here as a decision maker, I simply can comfortably say I don't believe, given what the current use of the area is, that it will not result in an appreciable loss. And so I'm happy to move the motion and look forward to the debate from my colleagues. I'll sum up in a right of reply at the end.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Baldock. I think most of it's been said, but I'll certainly add my tuppence here. When you look at it, the centre's only taken up a small area of the reserve. And again, it's allowing for future development if they wish to do so as regards to marine use on both sides. The point here is that this will be the only marine research and education facility focused on resilience and restoration of our urbanised coasts. This, to me, in my opinion, it's a fantastic opportunity that we must work with. Admittedly, there will be a small loss of level of service via the reserve land for our public, but what again is important to me is that the Waikato University is preparing to include our community to be part of their new research centre. And it's letting the community, I feel, it's letting them see and feel what their land is being used for.
A point of order, Mr. Chair. Yeah. Is this within the scope of our decision making this morning?
Well, I think we just need to read the legal advice, and that the university or not is not the matter which we are meant to, you know. You'll undoubtedly, according to the advice, have some influence, or be influenced perhaps by that, but it's not the key decision. So probably best to just try and stick to that if you can. Thanks.
I know
without telling you what to say.
I know that, and it's perhaps a little hard for me, but I'm only expressing my views, and again, it's my own opinion, which I'm allowed to do so, and that's democracy, isn't it? I'm just saying again that I just feel that it's giving the opportunity for the public to be part of it, and for me that is very important. It also, if it does go ahead, it also gives us the opportunity, and when I say part of it, to help design it. And not only ourselves, the tangata whenua and our community as well. So again, look, simply this, it's an opportunity, it's a win-win for all. Certainly consider it.
Thank you. And Councillor Clout.
Thank you. I certainly support this revocation process continuing to the Minister. If you look at the usage graph on page 50, it's very clear to see that on average there may be 4 or 5 people using that whole of the green space north of the blue line, the blue square, including the blue square, over a 3 or 4 hour period. And to me that just really says that it is not well utilised at all. Also, we were, of course, when we were looking at the Sulphur Point North area, the users there were very adamant that they would rather see us taking away land from the recreational sort of assets of the city in that sort of marine park area rather than the Sulphur Point North area. I note that having a smaller amount of green space is not necessarily going to mean less use, because if you look at what happened down at the historic village when the tech hub went on there, people were saying that the green space was going to be compromised, much lesser quantity of green space. However, we know that the quality of that green space down there now has been enhanced through good drainage works. So the fact that there is a small amount of green space on Marine Reserve does not mean it's going to be any less used. So I'm very comfortable to proceed on that basis.
Thank you. I support this. It's been quite a to and fro decision, but my basis, a lot of things to discuss today, is that Simpson and Grierson have given us an legal opinion that it does meet the requirements of the Reserves Act, and that's what this conversation is about. It's about the reserve. Given that we're talking about surplus to requirement and appreciable loss of reserves, we have over 1,500 hectares of reserves and parks, 240 reserves, coastal reserves. We have 300 reserves and undevelopable land that will be open space and coming into Tumu. So, our 394 sites, we have a heck of a lot of parks and reserves across the city, plus we're also lucky enough to live in a coastal environment as well. This reserve is not located in a residential area. It's not a local park. It's not like your kids are going to pop down to that park and use it. And while the usage is low, we do know and we accept that the southern part is heavily utilised for boat ramps and the fishing, the fishermen, etc. But this area, we have the figures there that isn't well utilised. Because the question that went out to the community did refer to the University of Waikato, and our 58% responded no and 42 yes. Part of the problem with that particular question is that it didn't refer to the quantity of reserves and parks that we have, so it's out of context. It doesn't refer to the building size being about a third of the area. It doesn't refer to the university being community focused. It doesn't refer to a shared area and to being open to the community for community usage. And we also know that if there was to be a lease, some of those concerns can be managed. Can be managed through that lease. So, just answering to specifically the fact that the question did mention the University of Waikato is why I bring those points into my comments. So, fully support. Thank you.
Amendment, Mr. Chair? The amendment I seek would be an alternative C, given that that is now not being moved. And that would read, if revocation is successful, that other proposals for the use of the site be sought. So I'll just repeat that. If revocation is successful, that other proposals for the use of the site be sought.
If there's a seconder for that, we can discuss it. I just think it possibly gets confused in that there's this, if this request for revocation goes through, then first of all, the minister then decides whether it happens, and then we actually decide the use. It's a separate thing.
It just makes that
so
clear.
whether you would, yeah. So, I mean, if you get a seconder, it can be discussed, put it that way.
I'm trying to clarify to the public that that is the intent.
Yeah. So if you don't get a seconder now, you can obviously, well, if we're around, we can bring it up again. So it hasn't got a seconder, so we'll continue on. Speakers, Councillor Mason.
Happy to support this. I thank Councillor Granger in particular for his very broad contextual discussion, and noting that most of it was context only. And I'd also like to thank the, certainly the submitters and all the parties involved. In particular, staff for what I found to be a very good document, well supported by facts. It was, I like the key themes, which was well laid out and easy to understand and easy to come to a conclusion about the potential revocation. Having listened to a lot of the different stakeholders all the way down, and in relation to the wider context, but also to the revocation. I think the people who use the and live and work, not live, but work on that space, and have got a very, very deep and long relationship with it. Have are all of the, not all, but many of the opinion that space is not utilised and therefore could be revoked in terms of its status. So I think most of the statements have been made very eloquently by the other speakers. There's no point in continuing with that, but certainly would support the revocation on the basis that it is surplus to requirements, and certainly it results in appreciable loss of service amenity for the public.
Thank you, Worship. In terms of the decision-making context, Section 24(1)(b) of the Act talks about the local authority being able to make a decision to send the request to the Minister for any reason, and it's my view that statutory test has been met, not simply because of the reasons given within the recommendation, which are areas not currently being utilised for any significant recreational purpose, or that it's unlikely to result in an appreciable loss of the reserve amenity of level service for the public. Not just because of those reasons, I would submit that there are other reasons as well, which further give weight to the any reason, which is singular, maybe one, but there are many more. This is a proposal for a revocation of a portion of the reserve. It is not a proposal for a revocation of the reserve, and I think that that's an important distinction to make. I think that the legal and staff advice has been relatively conservative in this regard. If you look at what Auckland Council is trying to do presently with a revocation of a part of a reserve in Auckland, they are stating very simply it is so that the Stroke Foundation can have a building there and administer services. So they are very clear that that is their reason, and they seem happy to stand by that. However, I mean, if you look at the the principles of the Reserve Act, and I believe the legal test has been made, and it is appropriate for us to make a decision, that when it goes to the Minister, he or she can make the decision according to his or her discretion. So the Minister, of course, has discretion. And when you're looking at the principles of the Act, the proposed revocation of a portion of the reserve does maintain public access along the seacoast, because you can see there the proposed area of the revocation is inland. There is public access and reserve designated land along the seacoast there. In terms of ensuring as far as possible the survival of all indigenous species of flora and fauna, in terms of the reserve network, you could argue that there's some interesting fauna up at the Sydenham Botanical Garden, although not all the kauri are native. But, if we were to protect Kaikuya as a significant sort of piece of vegetation then, and it were endangered, then I would see that perhaps a portion of the reserve not being revoked may be appropriate. But given that Kaikuya is not an endangered species, or not species, an endangered flora, then I think that that's okay. In terms of the wildlife, again, I have not seen any significant wildlife. There has been the occasional earthworm spotted, the occasional Canada goose, and the occasional black swan on that site. But I would not suggest that area, that portion of the reserve, needs to be retained in order to protect those important species. The recreation use or potential is something which I think needs to be considered, although reasons have already been given, and it is our discretion to weigh those. I recall using the reserve in 1992 for the Trust Bank Intermediate Schools Triathlon. I have not used the reserve since until I walked down there to have a look, and unlike some mayoral candidates, I think that being local matters, and so there's a bit of local knowledge there. I know every time I've driven down there to the yacht club, the entire space of the reserve gets little use apart from the parking of boats. So I think that the revocation of this portion of it will not affect, say, the 11 people who may wish to exercise on the remaining portion of the reserve. So I think that all the tests have been made. We have a valid reason. We have many valid reasons why this may be revoked, and it is defensible. And I do again state for the record that this is a revocation of a portion of the reserve which the local authority may decide to send to the minister for any reason. A reason, many reasons have been given by myself just now. And so I think that we are able to do this. And then we'll find out what the minister's decision is in due course.
Thank you, Councillor Attenborough. And Councillor Kurak next. Thank you.
I agree with Councillor Baldock in terms of the issue around the land being surplus, because it is not. And I agree with Councillor Baldock in terms of the appreciable loss being subjective, because it is, and that's what we need to sort of consider. In our minds, do we think it's appreciable, that loss? And so I don't agree with the report and other speakers. I think it is appreciable when you put it into the context that most people would put it into. It's not about the whole network of city reserves that needs to be considered, in my view, in terms of making the decision around appreciable loss. I think that the loss really is lost opportunity, and it's for the future, about the potential better utilisation of the reserve space for what it's there for, wider public use. I don't know what they could be, but you just don't know what you don't know. You just don't know the future offerings that might come along. So if this revocation is successful, I certainly would like to go out to the wider community, and I hopefully my fellow members are open to that, and we're not looking at simply accommodating the university. It's very noble, but we need to look wider than that and think, well, in the context of lost opportunity, what else potentially could we do with that site if it wasn't a reserve? And that's the great unknown, because the university has got other options, as it's pointed out in the report. And even when I look at it last night, I thought, well, the area to the right of the boat ramp there, where there is boat parking, that could easily be shifted further north, and the university accommodated there. There's not a huge cost. There's a bit of bitumen there and some fencing that could be transferred, that fencing, and some new bitumen laid out. You could have an entry at the top, and boats come down and park their boats on an angle and drive out the bottom end. It'd be an appropriate use for that site, because it's currently not reserved, that area of boat parking. And I hear that the university, if I can talk about the university proposal, there are other opportunities further down around where it currently operates, and it's claimed by somebody in the public that there are ongoing discussions around that. Should this fail, because obviously the university needs to look and be open to other opportunities should the minister say no. So I think when weighing up the proposal and keeping it in the context of the revocation of the reserve and that loss or appreciable loss, that in my mind, being subjective, it's a no. And that's not a no for the university. I think they will be accommodated, and accommodated well, if this wasn't an option. So it's about tomorrow, not about today. And with the tomorrow lens on, and one area of reserve that was revoked and that we've sort of talked about very recently, in fact this week, is the ambulance facility, that St John's facility on Girvan Road, when I first looked at it, I thought, well, what dumb council allowed the ambulance station to plant a building on some reserve space where they could have been accommodated in a commercial area or more appropriate area? And I think this is what's going to happen here. In 30 or 50 years' time, people would think, who was that dumb council that allowed this big structure to compromise that precious, very precious piece of reserve space? Honestly, that's what will happen, because the university can put its facility in a more appropriate location. Thank you.
I'm going to echo much of what Councillor Kurak said. And Councillor Baldock is right. It's not about iwi or hapu, and it isn't about marine expansion. I agree that it is about, as in his words, the application by the University of Waikato, but it's not about the merits of that. I'm a great supporter of the university. I currently have an email. I've got to go and select who will be part of the selection team for a scholarship that I've set up with the university for people with an interest in local government. So this would be perhaps an interesting exercise for them to review. It isn't surplus to requirements. Again, I agree with Councillor Baldock. I agree with Councillor Kurak. It is, and I disagree with Councillor Baldock, and I agree with Councillor Kurak, an appreciable loss. I've heard comments from some colleagues about the quality of the report. Frankly, I think the report lacked scope and it lacked balance. When you have this is almost a caricature in a sense. It's almost been a two-dimensional analysis. People have looked at space. They talk about meters squared. But of course, we live in a three-dimensional world, and vision and what one sees, visual amenity, is actually really, really important, really, really valued. There's an enormous value placed by people getting a view of water, an unobstructed view of water, people paying millions of dollars for it. Now, many of our public, for various reasons, can't avail themselves of those things, certainly on a daily basis. I don't think the assessment of the loss of amenity has been roundly, properly considered. And with regard to the lack of balls referred to by Councillor Baldock, crystal balls, we have an obligation, I think, to look forward. It's not just in Arataki that we see the evidence of people who perhaps haven't thought further ahead. And I suppose most concerning of all for me is the man who's championed transformation of the city, albeit somewhat over-enthusiastically, looking at the project results that has delivered or not delivered, isn't thinking ahead here as much as perhaps some others would if they were in his seat. We know, looking at the Tauranga urban strategy, looking at the future development strategy, we know, looking at our transport strategy, we're trying to build a livable city. We're trying to build a city where we have population centres at the top end of the Te Papa Peninsula, and to make those spaces full of amenity, and a large green space, unobstructed by anything, is extraordinarily valuable. We know the population projections on the city alone forecast an increase over the lifetime of the lease of at least 50%, possibly 100% more people living here. In terms of the Te Papa Peninsula, many times that more increase in population. One doesn't need a crystal ball to predict the growth of the city. We have the population projections, ironically, produced by people associated with the University of Waikato that tell us what's coming. I can't get past the size of the loss. It is appreciable. It will be noticed. I think that say it's not is flying in the face of reality, or, as I say, adopting a somewhat two-dimensional view of the world. And our city deserves councillors who think in 3 dimensions and think not just of now but of the future. I fear where this goes, and I fear that the decisions of the minister will reflect the same level of, I don't know what I can call, sort of unenvisioned thinking that I'm hearing evidence of here. We shall see. I hope. But yeah, I can't support the motion.
Other speakers? Councillor Clout, have you spoken? Or? Oh, forgotten. Oh, right. No, it was me that. It's me that hasn't spoken. Councillor Malloy. Sorry. Yeah, go for it.
You need to think I was invisible, Mr. Chairman. I'll keep mine short because I can see fatigue creeping into the audience. As I said, I will keep it short. With the Act, the area is not currently being used for any significant recreational purposes and is unlikely to result in appreciable loss of public amenity. So in terms of the Act and also the legal opinion we've got would indicate that. I also believe that the way the facility is to be developed, it will be a public amenity and it will be a strong attractor to the area. You know, I'd be very, very surprised if when this isn't built and operating, we don't see a significant increase in the public use of the area. The university is not a commercial entity, and if it was, or any other commercial entity, I'd be very, very reluctant to make this decision. It's not an easy decision, but I have to vote for it. Thank you.
Okay, so the whole area is a busy area, and I've spent a fair bit of time down there because I go down there to escape. There's a wonderful little beach at the end of the area, and that's so well used by families, particularly over summer, but believe it or not, also in winter as well. We're also as busy as the boat ramp area, but it's not what you'd call a pristine environmental area. It's an area where people launch boats, which are generally motor powered, save the occasional yacht, and then they escape to sea and engage in fishing. If this area included right down to the waterfront, I'd be opposed to it, because that would be an appreciable impost on the use of that park. But from the ones that I see using it now and the ones that will be using it in the future, they walk along funnily enough, the waterfront, okay, as opposed to, it's not like a rugby field where people go and play that. So I believe that there is room for a number of users in that area, and therefore to revoke this reserve status on this particular chunk won't make that appreciable difference. As I say, it would be different if it was right down to the water. That is the key for me and my decision on that. I'm also thinking that with the way it's designed too, if that's removed, there is room to include a considerable chunk of further boat and trailer parking there. And be quite frank, after that, that's probably the maximum you can handle when you look at the channel going and you look at the activity that goes on there. So to think that it could be filled up entirely with boat and trailer parking is not right either. So therefore I'm prepared to support it. I am minded, it doesn't have anything to do with my decision though, that the regional council through a senior councillor did make an offer of a significant sum of money, and if that money could be in some way used to offset that, that's something I would like to pursue at a later date, but I certainly haven't forgotten that very generous offer. But it's nothing to do with the decision today. Right of reply, Councillor Baldock.
Thank you. That's been a very interesting debate. I was holding my breath when Councillor Attenborough was describing some of the species, flora and fauna. I was a bit worried he was going to say something derogatory about fisher folk, which would have offended my brother, who's a mad fisherman, but he avoided that, fortunately. This is the next step in the process. We know there's still a long way to go, and as has been said, once, if the revocation goes for approval from the Minister, there are still many decisions this council will have to make. And been through some of those in the past, and they'll be challenging ones, I think, to get through. I think we have to recognise, and I think Mayor Brownless was touching on it, that one piece of land, one reserve, cannot meet the needs of a growing city like this. We have lots of reserves, but as we grow, we will have to provide further reserves, and I believe we will. We actually are already cooperatively with the Regional Council in Western Bay trying to see a reserve or a regional park established right at the end of our Rohi, in Tutumu. And it'll be if we can get it arranged, it'll be a fabulous facility where people can enjoy the waterfront and the marine environment. If the city expands to the north around the harbour, we'll provide more reserves, and probably there'll have to be more marinas also somewhere, and that study needs to be done to find out where we could establish those in the harbour. And at that place, where many people will be going anyway, there will be provision of reserve space. I think you just can't squeeze it all into one place. So I hope the Minister will look up YouTube and enjoy herself listening to our debate today, and will know that we are committed to reserve space in this area, that we are going to expand further spaces, and she may look on this application that we agree to today favourably, but it will be at their discretion, at the Minister's discretion, and we will await that decision.
So I'll put that by the show of hands. It'll be recorded. So all those in favour, raise your hand. It's myself, Councillor Mason, Baldock, Morris, Clout, Granger, Brown and Malloy, and against is Councillors Robson and Kurak. So that motion is carried. Thanks everybody for your participation today, and declare the meeting closed.